Imagine this. You're a caveman, belly growling, excited to open your lunchbox. You sit down, unwrap the bundle of leaves you carefully tied up the day before, and bam, the smell hits you harder than a mammoth's fart. What was once a juicy chunk of meat is now a slimy science experiment, buzzing with flies. Congratulations. You've just invented prehistoric food poisoning. And here's the thing, our hairy ancestors had to deal with this every single day. Because guess what? They didn't have the luxury of a big humming fridge like you do right now, stuffed with sodas and leftover pizza. Now, don't laugh too hard. Strip away electricity, grocery stores, and that one roommate who steals your snacks. And suddenly you're right back with Mr. Caveman, trying to figure out how to stop your dinner from turning into a biological weapon overnight. And make no mistake, figuring out how to keep food from rotting wasn't just a nice-to-have skill. It was survival. You couldn't just run to a drive-thru. You either stored food smart, or you spent your life running around hunting, gathering, and eating raw berries until your stomach gave up. So, the caveman's solution. Pure, desperate ingenuity. These people looked at dirt, fire, salt, fat, and pots of mud and went, yeah, let's make this work. And somehow it did. Their tricks were weird, gross, and sometimes genius. Honestly, you'd be surprised how many of their storage hacks still work today. Ever heard of dry-aged beef? Cavemen were basically the uncredited inventors. Jerky. Yep, that too. Fermentation. They didn't call it kombucha, but it was basically caveman. Probiotics. Picture this. A tribe sitting around a fire, sharing dried strips of smoky meat that don't smell like death. Another clan burying clay pots in the cool ground to keep berries fresh for weeks. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept them alive. And for us, peeking into their bizarre toolbox of food hacks is like finding the original life hacks, playlists menace, the catchy background music. So here's the ride. We're about to go through the caveman's 7 fridge-free methods of keeping food edible. No fancy appliances, no buzzing power bills, just raw instinct and dirt under the fingernails. And if you're thinking, I'll never need this, just wait until the power goes out, or until your camping trip turns into a survival reality show you didn't sign up for. Suddenly, you'll wish you paid attention to how the caveman stored his mammoth steak. By the way, let's not pretend cavemen were delicate chefs with culinary finesse. These people burned half their food, ate the other half raw, and somehow thought licking bones was a solid dessert plan. But when it came to storage, that's where their creativity shined. Without a fridge, they had to treat the earth, fire, and even animal fat like part of their toolkit. And you know what? It worked so well that echoes of those hacks are still hiding in our modern kitchens. So buckle up, or, in caveman terms, tie that fur cloth tighter, because in the next part, we're going underground. And I don't mean metaphorically. I mean literally. Cavemen dug holes in the dirt, tossed food in, and hoped it didn't come out crawling with worms. Spoiler, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But hey, if you've ever thought of dirt as useless, you're about to see how it could double as nature's very first refrigerator. So here's the caveman's version of a fridge. Dig a hole in the dirt, toss your food inside, cover it back up, and hope Mother Nature does the rest. Sounds ridiculous, right? But you'd be surprised. Dirt is basically the prehistoric cousin of air conditioning. Beneath the surface, the soil stays cooler than the scorching sun above, especially if you go a few feet down. Cavemen figured this out without a thermometer. Just trial and error. The first poor guy probably buried a leg of mammoth just to hide it from other hunters, and came back shocked that it hadn't turned into mush. Boom, underground storage was born. Now, picture it. A sweaty caveman, digging with his bare hands, grunting like he's inventing CrossFit. He plops a chunk of meat into the hole, piles on dirt, maybe throws a few rocks on top so the wolves don't steal it, and calls it a day. Fast forward 3 days, he digs it back up, and surprise, the meat doesn't stink much. Sure, it's not perfectly fresh, but compared to leaving it in the sun, it's practically gourmet. This trick wasn't just about meat, either. Nuts, tubers, roots, anything. The tribe wanted to last longer, often went into the dirt locker. If you're rolling your eyes thinking, no way, dirt keeps food safe, well, modern people still do this. Ever heard of a root cellar? That's just a fancier hole in the ground, with some wooden beams slapped together. Farmers use them to keep potatoes, carrots, onions, and apples edible for months without electricity. Cavemen were basically the inventors of root cellars, minus the Pinterest-worthy wooden doors. But of course, it wasn't foolproof. Dig in the wrong spot and you've got a problem. Too shallow. The sun heats the dirt, and your food still rots. Too close to water. Congratulations, you've made swamp soup. Too lazy to mark the spot. Well, now your dinner's gone forever. And the wolves thank you for the free buffet. And don't even get me started on bugs. Ants and worms were basically the freeloaders of prehistoric food storage, crawling in and throwing a rave the moment you looked away. Yet, the underground trick bought caveman precious time. Instead of eating everything immediately, they could store food for later, freeing them from constant hunting. Imagine how revolutionary that felt. Not having to chase down a deer every single morning just to survive. With a little dirt magic, they had leftovers. And believe me, leftovers are what allowed humans to finally stop living like exhausted raccoons and start building real communities. And hey, it wasn't all about practicality. Sometimes, burying food became ritual. Imagine a tribe marking certain pits as sacred storage, with elders teaching youngsters where and how to dig. Cavemen may not have had cooking shows, but this was their version of passing down grandma's recipes. Dig deeper. Kid, or the meat will rot, and your cousins will laugh at you. Generational wisdom, caveman style. Want a modern test? Next time you go camping, dig a hole a couple feet down, stick a bottle of water inside, and cover it. Come back a few hours later, and it's noticeably cooler. That's exactly what cavemen relied on Earth as nature's cooler box. They didn't need electricity. They just needed patience, strong arms, and the ability to remember which random spot of dirt they buried dinner in. Of course, there were disasters. Picture this. One caveman pulls his stash out only to find it crawling with maggots. He takes one bite, immediately regrets it, and boom, he's the village joke for weeks. Or worse, a bear digs it up before he can. That's the gamble of underground storage. Either you win dinner, or you feed the wildlife. Still, compared to letting meat rot under the sun, it was worth the risk. So, cavemen dug, and buried, and dug again. Every successful pit was another step towards civilization. And every failed pit was another reminder that nature doesn't play fair. But it was clever, and it worked often enough to keep tribes alive. Which means, like it or not, the first refrigerators weren't humming in a kitchen. They were humming with worms, underground. And if you think that's primitive, just wait until you hear about their next hack. Dirt was clever, sure, but smoke was pure caveman genius. Why just bury your food when you can turn it into chewy, smoky strips that last week's... Forget Uber Eats. Up next is the original caveman beef jerky. Alright, let's talk about the caveman's most iconic storage hack, drying meat. Forget freezers, forget plastic. Our ancestors basically invented beef jerky before it was cool. They didn't call it jerky, of course. To them, it was just survival. But here's the beauty. Drying and smoking meat over fire meant you could eat days, even weeks later, without gagging on the smell of rot. That's not just clever, it's culinary wizardry by Stone Age standards. Picture it. The tribe has just taken down a giant deer. The celebration is wild, everyone's cheering. Kids are gnawing on bones. Hunters are flexing like they just unlocked a new level in a video game. But then the reality kicks in. This deer is massive. You can't eat it all in one sitting, unless you want a food coma so bad you forget how to walk. And tomorrow, that meat's gonna smell like a sweaty mammoth armpit. The solution, slice it thin, hang it near the fire, and let smoke and heat do their magic. The caveman jerky making process was both brutal and brilliant. First, they hacked the meat into strips. Nothing pretty, just sharp rock versus muscle. Then, they strung those strips up on wooden racks over the campfire. The heat dried out the moisture, while the smoke added a layer of protection, keeping bugs and bacteria at bay. Slowly, the meat shrank, toughened, and transformed into something that could last days without spoiling. Chewy, yes. Delicious. Depends how hungry you were. But life-saving, absolutely. Now, imagine the taste. You bite into one of those leathery strips, and your jaw gets the work out of its life. It's smoky, salty if they had salt, and tough enough to double as a shoelace. But here's the thing, it fills your belly and doesn't kill you with food poisoning. And in caveman times, that was all that mattered. Chewy meat beat starving every single time. This trick wasn't just about meat either. Cavemen learned to smoke fish, too. Catch a pile of river trout, hang them over smoldering embers, and you had yourself a stash of edible fish sticks that wouldn't rot overnight. The smell must have been incredible. Smoky, rich, a scent that probably made nearby wolves drool from miles away. But for the tribe, it meant security. No hunting tomorrow. No starving if the weather turned bad. Just grab some smoked strips, chew until your jaw cries, and boom, you're alive. Then here's the cool part. This hack never went away. Look around today's beef jerky, smoked salmon, even bacon. It's the same principle, polished with seasoning and shiny packaging. Cavemen laid the groundwork for the modern snack aisle without even knowing it. They weren't making food for Instagram. They were making food that didn't kill them in 2 days. But somehow, it ended up tasting good enough to stick around for tens of thousands of years. Of course, not every drying attempt was perfect. Too much fire, and you got charcoal. Too little smoke, and bugs had a party. There were probably hilarious disasters. One caveman proudly offers his dried mammoth jerky, only for everyone to spit it out because it tastes like burnt bark. Or worse, he forgets to hang it high enough, and dogs, wolves, or some sneaky kid snatches the strips in the night. Food security in the Stone Age was basically one long prank war between humans and animals. Still, when done right, drying meat was revolutionary. It gave hunters freedom. They could travel farther, carry protein-packed strips, and feed the tribe during lean times. Imagine a hunter stuffing his fur pouch with smoked venison, hiking days into the wild, and still having food when the hunt took longer than expected. That's not just storage, that's survival strategy. And here's the funny irony. In modern times, we still love jerky, but now it's overpriced, sitting in shiny bags at gas stations with flavors like sweet teriyaki or maple bacon explosion. Cavemen would laugh their hairy heads off. To them, jerky wasn't a $7 snack. It was life insurance, made with nothing but fire, smoke, and desperation. So, underground pits kept food cool, sure, but smoked meat? That was the true game changer. Cavemen didn't just eat, they learned to preserve, and in the process, they invented one of humanity's longest-lasting food traditions. But don't relax yet, because their next hack is even weirder. It involves salt, sand, and a whole lot of hope that nature's pantry could do better than Mother Nature's garbage disposal. Now, if you've been nodding along thinking, okay, caveman jerky makes sense, brace yourself, because not every tribe had access to endless firewood or the patience to chew through a strip of meat tougher than your dad's old boots. Some of them got creative, really creative. Enter the bizarre duo, salt and sand. Let's start with salt. If a tribe was lucky enough to live near a salty river, mineral springs, or just stumbled upon natural salt deposits, they basically struck the Stone Age jackpot. Salt wasn't just about flavor, it was magic dust. Rub it on meat or fish, and suddenly bacteria struggled to grow. It dried things out, made them last longer, and gave food that extra kick that turned Ugg into a caveman. Probably didn't know the science, but they sure noticed that salted meat didn't reek like weak old mammoth guts. But salt wasn't always around. So what did desperate tribes do? They looked at the next best thing lying everywhere. Yeah, actual sand. Imagine this. Cavemen would pack meat or fruit in dry sand, bury it, and hope the grains would soak up enough moisture to slow down spoilage. Sounds crazy. Well, it kind of worked. The dryness of the sand created a barrier, keeping bugs and flies away while pulling some of the juice out of food. Think of it like nature's very own dehydrator minus the user manual. Of course, this method had its downsides. Ever tried eating a piece of meat with grit in it? Not exactly fine dining. Picture a caveman gnawing on a sandy hunk of venison, spitting pebbles like a broken lawnmower, and pretending it tastes crunchy. The tribe probably laughed at him, but hey, at least he wasn't starving. And honestly, sand-packed food often kept long enough to matter. Cavemen weren't looking for Michelin stars, they just needed calories. The real savagery came when they mixed the two. Salt, when available, was rubbed onto meat. Then, to double the protection, the food was buried in layers of sand or ash. Ash, by the way, was another secret weapon. After a fire, the leftover ash was dry, alkaline, and bug repellent. So a clever caveman might wrap fish in leaves, cover it in ash, bury it in sand, and walk away feeling like Gordon Ramsay of the Stone Age. Sure, it tasted like smoky chalk when you dug it up, but it didn't kill you. Survival over flavor, dash always. And here's where it gets interesting. These methods weren't just random, they set the stage for future culinary traditions. Ever heard of salted cod, prosciutto, or pickled fish? All rooted in the same caveman logic: take away moisture, add minerals, stop rot. Sand storage echoes even today in some cultures that preserve root vegetables by layering them in sawdust, sand, or straw. Turns out, what looks primitive was actually genius. Now imagine the daily grind of this. Hunters bring back meat. Women and kids scrape it down, rub it with salt if they had it, then bury it in sand pits or ash mounds. Every meal was a gamble. Dig it up too soon, and it was raw and gritty. Leave it too long, and it hardened into something resembling a fossil. Still, it bought them precious days. And in a world where hunting was exhausting and dangerous, those extra days meant survival. Of course, mistakes happen. A young caveman might dig up the wrong sandpit, proudly carry back a chunk of meat, only for everyone to gag when they taste it. Or worse, a rainstorm might flood the burial site, turning their food storage into swamp stew. But every failure was a lesson, passed down with grunts, gestures, and a lot of teasing. Here's the funny part. While you're sitting there reading this and thinking, E.W. gross, sand in my food. Remember, our ancestors did this so you could one day complain about your soggy fries. Without these hacks, humanity might not have survived long enough to invent refrigerators or fries. So yes, salt and sand saved lives. They turned cavemen from frantic hunters into and sure, their meals had extra crunch sometimes, but at least they weren't starving. And that, for a caveman, was worth every gritty bite. Next up though, things get even smarter. Dirt and sand were clever. Smoke was genius. But clay pots were where cavemen accidentally stumbled into becoming engineers. Maybe the first people to brag about food storage containers. If you think cavemen were all about banging rocks and grunting, think again. These folks were surprisingly crafty engineers. One of their most brilliant hacks. Clay pots. Yep, plain old mud, shaped, baked, and turned into the Stone Age version of Tupperware. Forget plastic lids. Forget neon-colored lunchboxes. Our ancestors had clay, and they made it work. Here's the scene. A tribe settles near a river with rich, squishy mud. Somebody realizes, hey, this stuff hardens in the sun. Next thing you know, they're molding bowls, jars, and pots out of the dirt, drying them by the fire. And suddenly, they've got storage containers. For food, for water, for seeds. Clay became the miracle material. And while it cracked sometimes, when it worked, it was like caveman magic. So how did they use these pots to keep food fresh? Simple. Clay pots acted like little natural coolers. When filled with water or fruit and buried partly underground, the porous clay allowed moisture to slowly evaporate, lowering the temperature inside. That meant berries stayed juicy longer, seeds didn't sprout too early, and water didn't taste like hot soup after a day in the sun. Imagine biting into a cool, slightly chilled berry on a blazing hot afternoon suddenly. Life didn't feel so brutal, and it didn't stop there. Clay pots could also be sealed. Cavemen learned to cover them with leaves, mud, or even slabs of rock. Sometimes, they coated the inside with ash or fat, more on that later, creating airtight jars. Into these jars went dried meat, nuts, or precious grains. Without pots, everything had to be eaten immediately. With pots, suddenly you could stash things for weeks or even months. That's not just storage, that's civilization in a jar. Ever heard of a Zier pot? Modern survivalists still use them. It's basically two clay pots, one inside the other with wet sand in between. As the water evaporates, it cools the inner pot. This same principle has been around for thousands of years. Cavemen didn't have YouTube tutorials, but they figured it out by noticing how wet clay always felt cooler. Nature gave them the hack, and they ran with it. And here's a funny mental picture. A bunch of cavemen sitting around, bragging about whose clay pot is better. One guy's pot leaks, another's explodes in the fire. And the third one, probably the tribe's nerd, has a perfect jar that keeps berries fresh for a week. You can bet that guy became the MVP of the group. In the food game, pottery was the real flex. Of course, not everything was perfect. Clay pots were fragile. Drop one, and boom, there goes your dinner. Rain could crack them, fire could shatter them, and nosy animals could tip them over. Imagine a caveman crying over spilled berries the way you cry over spilled coffee. Same vibe, different era. Still, the invention of clay storage transformed daily life. Hunters could bring home meat, and instead of watching it rot in the sun, the tribe could store it for days. Gatherers could stash nuts and seeds, ensuring food for leaner times. Suddenly, the tribe wasn't chained to the eat it now or lose it forever cycle. They had breathing room, and breathing room meant growth. And don't forget the ceremonial side. Some pots weren't just for storage, they became symbols. Picture a clan elder teaching the young how to mold clay, saying, "This jar will hold food for your children." Clay became culture, not just utility. In many ways, it was the first step from surviving toward thriving. Today, when you crack open a jar of pickles or admire a terracotta water jug, you're looking at echoes of that same caveman brilliance. They turned mud into life-saving tech, long before Silicon Valley claimed to invent disruption. But as great as clay pots were, they weren't foolproof. Air could still sneak in, bugs could crawl inside, and moisture could ruin everything. That's why cavemen came up with another trick, one so greasy and weird it actually worked. They started sealing food with animal fat. Slimy, yes. Effective, absolutely. Alright, let's get messy. Because if clay pots were the caveman version of Tupperware, then animal fat was their cling wrap. Sounds disgusting. Oh, it absolutely was. But it worked. Cavemen figured out that if you cover food with a thick layer of fat or grease, it seals out air, keeps moisture from creeping in, and slows down the rot. Think of it as nature's greasy lock-on-key system. Here's how it happened. After a big hunt, the tribe would cook or melt down animal fat, thick, gooey, and very, very smelly. Then they'd pour or smear it over jars of food, sealing the top with a slippery lid of grease. Meat, berries, or even dried roots could hide under this fat blanket, staying safe for weeks. No bugs, no mold. Just food marinating in its own prehistoric version of cooking oil. If that makes your stomach turn, congratulations, you're a modern human. But for this was gourmet survival. Picture the scene. One caveman proudly lifts the lid off a clay pot. Inside, a layer of hardened white fat cracks open like ice. Beneath it, meat that doesn't smell like roadkill. The tribe cheers, because this slimy, greasy trick just kept them fed through another rough week. And let's be real, compared to eating rotten carrion or starving, fat-sealed meat was practically five-star dining. This wasn't just random trial and error either. Over time, tribes learned to get creative with fat sealing. Sometimes they cooked meat, poured melted fat over it in layers, and let it cool into a solid block. Basically, an accidental version of canned food. Other times, they dipped strips of meat in fat to create greasy jerky sticks. They didn't know the science, but the result was simple. Fat kept oxygen and bacteria away. The less oxygen, the slower the spoilage. And here's the crazy part. This method never died. Ever heard of potted meat or confit? It's the same idea. Meat stored under fat. French chefs still brag about duck confit today, but cavemen were out here doing mammoth confit long before fine dining existed. So next time you see a food critic swoon over slow-cooked meat and duck fat, just remember, it's a Stone Age hand-me-dash-down, of course. Fat sealing wasn't perfect. Hot weather could melt the fat, turning your storage jar into a greasy soup. Animals loved the smell, so wolves or bears would dig through the camp like it was an Olukani buffet. And every so often, someone forgot to cook the meat before sealing, it leading to a fat-covered disaster that smelled like a crime scene. But when done right, it was genius. And imagine the comedy. Some poor caveman trips, drops a jar, and suddenly there's grease all over the camp floor. Everyone slips like it's the world's first slapstick sketch. Or another one bites into fat-coated meat and gets a mouthful of grease, gagging while the rest of the tribe howls with laughter. Sure, it was gross, but it kept people alive. And cavemen weren't picky eaters, they were survivors. There's also something kind of poetic about it. Cavemen killed an animal, ate its meat, used its bones for tools, wore its skin for clothing, and then used its fat to preserve even more food. Nothing went to waste. It wasn't pretty, but it was efficient. They didn't have the luxury of throwing away parts. Every drop of fat mattered, and every jar sealed with grease was a promise that the tribe could eat tomorrow. So yes, fat was gross. Yes, it was slimy, but it was also brilliant. And it taught humans an important lesson. Sometimes survival means embracing the disgusting. Because when your choice is between greasy meat or starving, you'll happily lick that fat off your fingers. But here's the final twist. Cavemen eventually learned that food storage wasn't just about hiding meat from rot, it was also about sharing it. Because if you hoarded everything for yourself, you'd either end up with spoiled food or with a spear in your back. Which brings us to their last and most human trick, sharing or starving. Now here's the part that modern snack hoarders will hate. Sometimes the best way cavemen stored food was by not storing it at all. They shared it. That sounds cheesy, like the end of a kid's cartoon, but it was brutally practical. See? In the Stone Age, selfishness could kill you faster than rotten meat. Picture this. One hunter drags back half a mammoth. It's way too much for him to eat alone, and no amount of sand, salt, clay, or fat is going to keep it fresh forever. If he hides it, the meat rots, predators sniff it out, and he risks a fight with a bear or worse, angry, hungry neighbors. But if he shares it with the tribe, everyone eats. Everyone's grateful. And tomorrow, when he comes back empty-handed, someone else will hand him a hunk of smoked deer or a handful of nuts. That wasn't charity. That was caveman insurance. Sharing food created bonds stronger than any clay pot. It built trust. It meant protection. A well-fed tribe was a loyal tribe. And in a world where saber-toothed cats lurked in the shadows and winter could wipe out entire families, loyalty was survival. The caveman who shared lived longer than the caveman who said, "Mine, all mine." It wasn't about being nice. It was about being smart. Think of it as the world's first social contract. You give meat today, you get meat tomorrow. You share berries now, you get jerky later. In a way, food sharing was the earliest bank account. Only instead of numbers on a screen, you had chunks of meat and strips of dried fish. And instead of overdraft fees, you had the risk of being left to starve alone. And you can imagine the drama, too. Some greedy caveman sneaks food into his cave, hoping to snack alone later. The tribe finds out, storms in, and suddenly, he's the prehistoric version of that guy everyone hates. Trust broken, reputation ruined, and probably a spear aimed at his back. On the flip side, the generous caveman who always shared, he became the hero, the leader, the one everyone followed. Not because he had the sharpest spear, but because he had the fattest clay pot and the biggest heart. Even today, echoes of that survival logic linger. Family dinners, potlucks, barbecues, they're all descendants of caveman sharing. Our ancestors figured out that food tasted better when eaten together, and it lasted longer when everyone pitched in to protect and prepare it. In other words, cavemen weren't just surviving, they were building community. So yes, dirt pits, smoke, salt, sand, clay, and fat all helped keep food around a little longer. But the real secret to survival wasn't in the storage hacks. It was in the tribe. The understanding that no one could do it alone. That the only way to beat hunger, wild animals, and the relentless march of time was to share the load, share the meat, and share the future. And that's the irony. In a world with no fridges, no freezers, no grocery stores, the most powerful food hack of all wasn't technological. It was human. Share or starve, that was the law of the Stone Age. So next time you open your fridge, grab a cold soda and slam the door shut without a second thought. Remember the caveman. He's somewhere in the back of your DNA, whispering, "Don't forget, keep it cool, keep it safe, and for the love of mammoth, share it before it rots."